Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. This is the latest in my series of videos comparing the Olympus EM1 III and the OM System OM1 II. I've used the cameras for a few more weeks now, and I wanted to update some of my previous assessments with the benefit of more experience of usage in the field. If you have not watched my previous videos in this series, I would recommend you do so first. I'll put a link to them here and in the description. If you have found any of these videos useful, please do give me a like and subscribe to show your appreciation. I want to make this video as succinct as possible, so I'm going to focus this update video around 5 photos, each of which illustrates a new finding which modifies or builds on my previous review in some way. Here is photo 1, and it is a photo taken not with my OM1 II, but of my OM1 II, taken with my phone camera. Now, I should say that in general, I still think the OM1 II electronic viewfinder, EVF, is clearly better than the EVF in the EM1 III. The OM1 II EVF is bigger and more detailed, and for that reason it feels much nicer taking photos on the OM1 II than the EM1 III, because the image you see before you take the shot and the review image you see after you have taken it looks so much more impressive. When you get the photos from the two cameras back home onto the monitor, that difference disappears, so the EVF quality is quite deceptive, but it does encourage me to shoot more with the OM1 II. Another huge positive for the OM1 II EVF, which I mentioned in my initial review, is that it seemed to be much more resistant to fogging than the EM1 III EVF. OM System's marketing materials for the OM1 II state that the OM1 II EVF features an anti-fogging coating for clear visibility in rainy conditions, or words to that effect. In fairness to OM System, my experience is that the EVF does resist fogging in rainy conditions, as shown in my initial review video. However, during a recent cold snap in the UK, I did unfortunately experience some fogging in the EVF, probably due to condensation from my breath, as shown in this photo. This is an issue which affects the EM1 III EVF also. In this case, the temperatures were probably just about freezing, and the camera had been outside in the cold for about 30 minutes before it fogged up. Possibly, this type of fogging is an issue that would affect every camera's EVF. It is difficult to see how it can be avoided entirely, but I wanted to clarify this point in case my initial review could be taken as saying that OM System had solved the issue of viewfinder fogging altogether. Obviously they haven't. Now, I know that a number of viewers of these videos are based in Canada and use their cameras in much colder conditions than I will ever likely encounter. So my question for them is whether EVF fogging is an issue which affects them, and if so, how do they deal with it? I would be interested to hear their opinions on this point. Photo 2, EVF funny turn. Okay, this next photo is one which I took a few nights ago using my OM1 II. What I want to talk about here is not the photo itself, but the performance of the EVF while I was taking the photo. When I took the OM1 II out of my bag and turned it on to take the photo, the camera EVF had a very strange reaction. The EVF went very bright briefly, and the frame rate dropped drastically. It seemed to have a sort of funny turn for a while, before it went back to normal, as if it did not like being used in the dark. After a few seconds, the EVF did go back to normal, and I was able to take this photo without much trouble. But in the month and a half since I've had the OM1 II, the EVF has had a few issues like this. I don't recall the EM1 III having any such issues. So in my initial review, I did highlight an issue with the OM1 II EVF seeming to react worse to transitions between dark and light conditions than the EM1 III EVF. I'm not sure whether this is strictly an EVF issue or to do with the sensor, as in some cases it seems to affect the screen also. I think my recent experience was another extreme example of this behaviour. It's not the end of the world, as the OM1 II does seem to sort itself out after a few seconds. It did not matter too much in my case. As you can see from the photo, there was not really any movement going on here, which gave any urgency to taking the photo. But I can see how this sort of issue could be problematic if it occurred just when you were trying to take a critical shot, and so it is something to be aware of. Photo 3. Dogs and Cats Subject Detect Mode. I've been experimenting with the wildlife subject detect modes. We have pet guinea pigs and gerbils. The cats and dogs setting on the OM1 seems to work well to detect rodents also. In my previous video on autofocus performance, I showed a photo of a guinea pig which I thought was quite impressive because the camera got the guinea pig's eye sharp while the lens was wide open and at minimum focusing distance. But to balance against that, in that case obviously the guinea pig was not moving very quickly. Since then I've used the cats and dogs subject detection mode on the gerbils. Now these are dark subjects shot in dark conditions and they do move very quickly. Again, I was shooting them at pretty much minimum focusing distance wide open, but this time through the bars of their cage. In this photo the gerbil is not moving, but it was still a challenging shot to take because the gerbils will tear around for a few seconds, then sit still for a very short period of time, and then move off again. So the camera had only a very brief period of time to lock onto the gerbil. From these sessions, there were plenty of out of focus shots which I had to delete. But overall, I think the OM1 handled these challenging conditions and performed very well, and I am pleased with how well the photos I got turned out. I have previously tried to shoot the gerbils in much less challenging conditions with the EM1 III, and it could not really keep up with them, to the extent that I just gave up trying to photograph them after a while. The OM1 did much better here. So just for the sake of comparison, let me show a photo taken with the EM1 III earlier this year. You can see here the EM1 III in theory had an easier task. These are much brighter conditions. My rough calculation is more than 2 stops brighter. I've stopped the lens down to f1.8 to give the autofocus more chance, and I've moved the focus point manually using the AF joystick. And in the end I did get an in-focus shot, shooting with continuous autofocus. But if we permit ourselves to pixel peep for a few seconds to compare the two images, I think not only the autofocus, but also the image quality of the OM1 is quite impressive, if we take account of the very different exposure settings for the two photos. So that is a further reinforcement of my view that both the autofocus and the noise performance of the OM1 is a step up from the EM1 III. Photo 4. Birds Subject Detect Mode. Next photo, and here I'm going to be very brief. I am not a bird photographer and I don't have a proper birding lens, but recently I have been playing with bird subject detection using my Olympus macro 60mm f2.8, which is yielding some interesting results. I am quite impressed with how well the OM1 bird detect works in combination with this macro lens, which was obviously not designed for this type of photography. I would like to try the OM1 with a proper birding lens at some point. Photo 5. Autofocus Box. This final photo is to illustrate an issue which came up when I was out shooting yesterday morning. I was shooting with a single autofocus point as normal, and I was trying to shoot the river between these two pillars. So I wanted to focus on the river and have the pillars in the foreground out of focus. The single autofocus point box in the EVF is much smaller than the gap between the pillars. However, while holding the camera in landscape mode, the autofocus would only focus on the pillars, not on the patch of river in between them. This suggests to me that the single autofocus point, which is shown in the OM1 EVF, is deceptive, because it seems that the actual box within which the OM1 will focus is larger than indicated in the EVF. In the end, I used the manual focus clutch on my lens to get the shot I wanted, and this photo with manual focus enabled is what you are looking at now. Interestingly, when I held the camera in portrait mode, the autofocus would grab the river between the pillars. This suggests to me that the actual autofocus box which the camera is using is a horizontal rectangle rather than a square, but I'm just surmising here. Some very cursory tests in my studio just now suggest that this is actually the case. Again, this is not a huge problem, but it is something to be aware of. The OM1 autofocus seems to be able to see and grab onto items which are outside the autofocus box, which is not always ideal. Conclusion. So that's the video, everybody. I will just close out with some more photos taken with the OM1 II in November. I wanted to come back and make this latest video just to update the review I gave in my previous videos on a few points. No doubt, as I shoot more with the OM1 II, I will have to refine my opinions further, and so I may make further update videos in future. Hopefully this series of comparison reviews has been useful. If it has, please do give me a like and a subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video. Goodbye.